Thanks for coming out tonight, and welcome to our workshop on religion and security in world affairs. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And on behalf of my colleague Eric Patterson, who you'll hear more from in a minute, I really want to welcome you to Georgetown and to the Berkeley Center for what looks to be a tremendous workshop. I thought I'd give you a little background. How many of you have been to Georgetown before? All right, about 2/3, so there's some background with Georgetown. The Berkeley Center has been here 6 years. We had nothing to do with the University of California, Berkeley. That's the first cause of some confusion. There's always some ties, but the name comes from one of our benefactors, a member of our board of directors. And the center, as I said, was created 6 years ago here at Georgetown, and the idea was, and still is, to use this moment in history where religion is emerging in world affairs as such a salient topic, to deepen the study of that topic, to bring scholars together, policymakers, government, military officials together to try to make sense of this new world. It came upon us, of course, most dramatically with September 11th, but continues in so many ways in our foreign policy, in our diplomacy, in the lives of our students, the futures of our students. So what the Berkeley Center does is bring together a faculty, including Eric and several others, who are interested in how religion intersects with existing global policy challenges, whether issues of security, human rights, or democracy. We have a major project here on the issue of religious freedom, which is a hot topic in the United States and around the world. And to really leverage the fact that we're in Washington, D.C., that Georgetown is a religious institution which, through its Jesuit tradition, is open to other religious traditions, open to the secular world, has always been working in close interface with our government. And you'll hear from Andrew Natsios, who I think really embodies that spirit of interaction and engagement in the policy world more than just about anyone else here on campus. So that's a little bit about the center, a little bit about what we do. I invite you to read more about the center. You can't avoid our publications and posters as you walk around the place, and there'll be a reception downstairs, of course, after the program tonight. Lots of material there for you to take away if you so choose. I wish you all the best over the next couple of days. You'll get a chance to see the campus, some of the venues here. I hope the weather holds up. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Matt Vaccaro from our partner, of course, the Naval Postgraduate School, who'll say a few words of welcome as well. Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome as well. We are very pleased to be working together with the Berkeley Center, and we thank you for taking the lead in hosting this endeavor. Your team has been very generous, both in their time and in their creative ideas, and we are very excited to be working with the Berkeley Center again. So thank you. It's nice to be here in your facility too. It's wonderful. I'm here on behalf, to welcome you on behalf of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which is launching a new initiative with the Naval Postgraduate School to conduct learning events that are innovative for your communities. Through the next few days, we're going to see that you come from many different walks of life. And the new institute is called the Collaborative and Adaptive Security Initiative. It is intended to sponsor cutting-edge learning programs like this one is intended to be. This is the debut event for us. We are still very much a work in progress. Later on Friday afternoon, you're going to have an opportunity to give us your input, and we would value that. Our name is meaningful to us, collaborative and adaptive. We want the initiative to be something that is for you, from you. In order to do that, we need to hear from you. So please feel free to grab us in the hallway or to write to us in the evaluation. Your ideas, your suggestions, we very much welcome that. So I won't say too many more things of welcome. I'm eager to hear our speaker this evening, somebody who I've been reading about my entire career and following Yes, it's true. And following his work through friends of mine that have worked for you and near you and around you. So it's an honor for me to be here this evening. So, Eric?
Well, welcome everyone. My name is Eric Patterson, and I've been here with the Berkeley Center for 4 years now. It's a pleasure to have you with us here, and I'll just make a few housekeeping comments. We'll save most of that for tomorrow morning. So let me just remind you that tomorrow morning we have registration, which means please show up at 8 o'clock between 8 and 8:30 at the Georgetown University Conference Center. We have maps for you when you leave tonight. When you go downstairs, there'll be maps. It's up on the main campus. It's easy to get to, and you can find myself or my colleague Nick right here, or our colleague who's downstairs, Aaron Coleman, and if you have questions about some of those dynamics, we'll answer them during the reception time tonight. Let me say this. Two important pieces of information for tonight. The first one is the restrooms are straight that way. So during the Q&A or later tonight, down the hallways that way, out the door on the third or the second level, we're on the third, or downstairs out the second level to your right are the restrooms. Let me also simply mention that the way that we'll run is we'll go for approximately an hour. We started a little bit late so we could herd in the last folks due to the rain and things. However, what we'll do is we'll be punctual tomorrow and on Friday. You'll see we'll push the schedule and we'll be as punctual as possible. So what we'll do tonight is in a few moments I'll introduce Professor Natsios. He'll talk for 25 to 30 minutes. He'll take some Q&A, and then I'll shut us down and we'll go downstairs to enjoy one another's company. Fair enough? Okay. So that being said, our guest tonight is a distinguished professor here at Georgetown University in our School of Foreign Service. But you know, he's had a distinguished career in public service as well. He's one of the few who has served as a Senate-appointed head of a department or agency, but who was also an elected official. As you know, he started his public service as an elected official. He was the presidential envoy, special envoy to Sudan. He served as the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. He's a published author, and he's a favorite professor here at Georgetown now that he's here. And there's more to be said. But without further ado, let me introduce our colleague, Andrew Natsios.
Is this thing on, or do I have to push a button? It's on? Okay. Okay. I'm Andrew Natsios, and I was going to give you a highly abstract lecture, and then Eric said, don't do that, so I won't. He gave me instead 145 questions to answer. No. But just a couple of things to begin with. The first thing is there is a reluctance of people in public office at the national level and the state level because of the nature of our democracy and our history and the U.S. Constitution, by the way, misinterpreted Constitution, not to discuss religion in the public square and not to deal with your faith, not to deal with religious issues, because somehow it is seen as un-American. And there is a reason for that. I mean, there is tensions in other societies because they have not found a way of dealing with the divisions that exist in religious visions that affect the way the society is governed. And our unique system, it is a very unique system. I know this is not politically correct to say now, but I believe America has a remarkable, and my family wasn't here when it was created, so I'm not, we were in a village in Greece. I actually was in the Ottoman Empire when my grandparents were born. So I'm not claiming any credit for this, but our system is remarkable in having settled some structural problems in society that work. And friends of mine in the developing world come here and they're astonished this system works. I mean, they say, there's a way of transferring this. I'm not actually sure there is. Sometimes we Americans think that we can transfer our system around the world. I'm not sure that's true. So the first thing I would say is you need to put aside this illusion that the U.S. Constitution prohibits public officials from dealing with religion. All it says is we will not make any law dealing with religion. It doesn't mean that we can't deal with religion. You know, our society is a very religious society still in many cases. In fact, in some ways, it's the most religious society of any developed country in the world. Now, the second comment I would make is that we in the West, particularly in Europe, because the religious traditions other than Islam have basically faded away. Europe is not a Christian society anymore. It's a post-Christian society. People do not go to church. Even though there are established churches in Europe, which I think is kind of interesting. There are a few exceptions to that. For the most part, I went to an Orthodox church in London, and I was talking to the priest who was from the United States. It was interesting. They had to get an Orthodox priest to be a priest in London from the United States because they couldn't find any in Britain. And the people in the church were from every Orthodox church in Europe, but almost none of them were British. I mean, originally, they were immigrants. So the immigrants are the ones going to church: Africans, Eastern Europeans, and people from the colonies, the former colonies generally. So Peter Berger said, who's a famous sociologist, I think he's retired now at Boston University, he said, Western society is an island of secularism in a sea of religiosity. And there is a problem in the United States among secular people and even among people in public office who have some kind of religious faith. Islamic, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, whatever. And Buddhism, you can say that. I have a very good friend who's a Buddhist monk in South Korea. He would not use the word faith because, you know, Buddhism is not it's a philosophy, it is not a theology. But nevertheless, it has some of the same characteristics of a theological system. That they in the developing world are by far the majority. We are a tiny minority in a minority. Unfortunately, because the West is dominant, people are beginning to think that's the way the world really is. And there are a few elite people in the developing world who can speak secular words, but if you actually talk to them, they have deep faith. If you go to southern Sudan, they know how to talk to Americans in a secular way. But when they know where you come from, they really talk, and you know that they see the whole world in religious terms. And in the conflict with the North, they see in religious terms. When American scholars say that religion has nothing to do with the conflict in Sudan, either they are naive American or haven't studied Sudan or haven't talked to anybody. It is not the only part of the conflict, but it is part of the conflict. It's indisputable that it's part of the conflict. So I think we have to put our secularism aside and the U.S. Constitution, not aside, but we have to realize that we are misinterpreting what the Founding Fathers told us. Okay? Public officials, particularly dealing with international affairs, if they don't deal with religion, they are not doing their jobs. They are not doing their jobs. Whether they are development professionals in AID or in the MCC, or career diplomats, or military officers. I have been all three. I was a lieutenant colonel when I retired from 23 years in the U.S. Army. I served in the first Gulf War. I was in the reserves. I was mobilized two times. So I know the culture of the U.S. military. My son just got back from Afghanistan. He left. He was 4 years in the military. He's a first lieutenant in field artillery. And I was a diplomat as envoy to Sudan, not as long as I was a military officer, but I've been a development professional. So I sort of know the mentality. I would argue when you're dealing with any place in the world other than Europe, you cannot do your job unless you understand the religious traditions of the society in which you're working. Why is that? Well, Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize for economics, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, he's probably the most revered development economist in the World Bank and AID, and he's almost 90 years old. He came a few years ago to speak here. And he famously said that what distinguishes a highly developed, rich country from poor countries is our institutions. What distinguishes the United States from poor countries is the density, the robustness, and the legitimacy of institutions. And he defines institutions, at least in his earlier books, as the rules of the game. What are the values of the society, and depending on whether you're in the economic sphere, whatever sphere you're in. But his later books now, he talks about institutions the way we would think of Georgetown as an institution, or higher education as an institution, or as the U.S. government as an organization or institution. Okay, so what distinguishes these societies between us is most of these societies have more informal institutions. They may be legitimate in people's eyes, but they're not formally established in law. They don't have legal rights. They're not robust. They're fragile in many cases. And some of them are imposed by all of us in the West. You know, when you go to, I tell aid officers, when they go to a developing country and they see Ministry of Health, people think of HHS, or the State Public Health Ministry. That's not how it works. Most bureaucracies in developing countries are patrimonial systems to fuel the power structure in the society. That's how the society is kept together, by the patrimonial system of the country, where loyalty, personal loyalty, through bosses in the organizational system and different elite networks, keep the society from flying into chaos. And Douglas North has written a book about this a few years ago called Violence and Social Orders. It's actually being read by the French. And when the French development intellectuals read American economists, you have to read them too. I mean, because the French don't normally do that. They're quoting Douglas North's new book on this, because I think it's so powerful, even though it's very abstract. We have in the United States 87,000 governments. 87,000 governments, most of them at the state and local level, not at the national level. We have 17 million legal businesses, 17 million. And we have something like 2.7 million nonprofit organizations, including religious institutions, charities, fraternities, service groups, you know, the associational life that Alexis de Tocqueville describes in Democracy in America, the famous book he wrote in the 1830s. In developing countries, in many developing countries, the only legitimate, in the people's eyes, legitimate, functional institutions with an established value system are the religious institutions. The government's dysfunctional, it's fragile, or failed. I just finished writing a book on Sudan, and so I'm going to use Sudan examples. I was at a conference of Protestant pastors and Catholic priests recently, Southerners in southern Sudan, and they said, Andrew, the only institution during the war was the army, the rebel army, now it's called the SPLA, and the church. The church not only conducted religious services, they ran whatever schools that were run. If there were any health clinics, they were run by the church. And they would assemble the village to make decisions. In southern Sudan now, if you go to a village and you are a priest or pastor, and you call a meeting, everybody in the village will come to the meeting. If a government official calls the meeting, you might get 20%, 30% of the people, if you're lucky. Okay? And if an international figure comes, they may not even come to the meeting, unless they're curious. Okay? So the authority figures in southern Sudan still are the church, even though maybe only about 70% of the south is Christian at this point. And that is true in the north as well. If you go to a rural area, it's the Sufist mullahs from the Sufist brotherhoods who are the most powerful, influential figures, because the Sufist brotherhoods in the rural areas are the dominant form of Islam, which is not widely known. It is not the Wahhabists or the Salafists who are those are urban people, and it's a kind of Islam that was imported by the Egyptians in the 19th century from the great universities in Cairo. Many Sudanese regard it as foreign and not truly Sudanese. It's the Sufists who are the most influential, and the Sufists are very ambiguous about the notion in Sudan of a Islamic state. That is an invention of the Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood. The Sufist imams, most of them would prefer a secular state, and they really don't want Sharia law, because they take a much more flexible view of what Sharia law is, with modern scholarship and modern thinking going into how they interpret it. The Salafists and the Wahhabists, for those of you who don't know this, accept the 4 generations following the Prophet as the only legitimate source of revealed truth in Islam. all successive generations of scholarship they reject as corrupt and heretical. And so they only accept the very early Islamic teaching, and that's it. And the Quran, of course, and the Hadith literature, the sayings of the Prophet. And this is a source right now of enormous conflict in Sudan. It is the central issue right now, is whether the North will be a secular state or a Islamic state, and what kind of an Islamic state. Okay. Eric asked me whether I was prepared when I took office as aid administrator to deal with religion. In fact, this is not bragging, I'm simply telling you, I think I'm the first aid administrator that made it an issue. Not because of President Bush. Some people think it's because of the faith initiative. It's nothing to do with that. It's probably because of my own curious evolution as a Christian. I was born into the Greek Orthodox Church, but when I moved to a small town in New England, there was no Orthodox church. My parents had the choice of a Roman Catholic church, and there were tensions between the Irish and the Greeks, so that was out, no Catholic church. Secondly, there was a Baptist church, and they didn't really like the highly evangelical Baptist church, so I was sent to the Congregational Church, the Puritan Church of New England, when I was a child. And when I was 5 years old, I didn't have much choice in the matter, and I was brought up in that church and almost became a congregational pastor, and then moved here and became Presbyterian, which in the old days, they were both of the Calvinist tradition, but neither are now in many respects. That's a judgmental comment, but they're not. They're not really Calvinists anymore. I left the church, the Presbyterian Church, to return to the Orthodox Church, but not the Greek Church. I go to the Antiochian Orthodox Church, which is the Orthodox Church of the Arab world. It's actually the ancient church. It's the first church founded by the Apostle Paul in Antioch in 43 AD. We say we are literally the oldest church other than Jerusalem, okay? But it is, all Orthodox churches are theologically and liturgically the same. It's just the language and the hierarchy that are different. And I've been there for 14 years, and now I will die in the church. If I had heard the divine liturgy of our church in English, I would have left a long time ago, because it is so beautiful. My wife is Roman Catholic. I went to this university 40 years ago, and I obviously teach here, so I know Roman Catholicism. And you know, in the old days, you took theology here from the Jesuits, and everybody had to take a theology course, and I did. And I had Father McHugh here 40 years ago, and learned Jacques Maritain and Jean Danielou and the great Catholic writers of the 20th century. So I'm familiar with Catholicism as well. Because I've been involved with Sudan, I was deeply involved in understanding Islam, all the traditions, all the conflicts. And you know, for those of you who don't know this, there are more divisions within Islam where people are actually, there's violence against each other than there is with the Christian world. People think this is all Muslim versus the West. That's complete nonsense. The African are mostly Sufists, and the Sufist Islam of Africa is at very great variance with Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. In fact, I had a major figure tell me, a Wahhabist or Salafist, who said the Sufis are heretics and they are not Muslims. Of course, the Sufis would say the Wahhabists are not Muslim. And a couple of weeks ago, a mob from a Sufist mosque in Sudan, in Khartoum, burned down a Sufist mosque in Omdurman, which is one of the 3 cities around Khartoum. Okay? It's quite shocking to me because we had not seen that kind of violence within the Sufist community, within the Muslim community in the north, which shows me that northern society is under severe stress and is beginning to come apart when you see that kind of violence going on. We have a PhD agricultural economist in the aid mission in Khartoum who's been with us 30 years. He's a very good friend of mine. And he has a PhD from, I don't remember the university, he's a brilliant economist. I didn't know he was a Sufist imam. He has his own mosque. And I said, "You have your own mosque?" He said, "Yes, I do, Andrew." And he is more a big advocate of a more secular state. But he's had his mosque for 30 years, and he's not a major figure, but he's part of the Sufist brotherhoods. And he was only able to say that to me because he knew that I was very sympathetic to understanding the religious traditions within the context of development. when I became and the other thing is I was with World Vision for 5 years, the evangelical NGO. It's actually it's much more ecumenical now, but it's still rooted in the Protestant evangelical tradition. That experience taught me a lot as well. I have this Buddhist monk friend of mine from South Korea. We went undercover into China in the middle of the North Korean famine when I was writing a book, and the Venerable Pomyong and I had a discussion through a translator, his aide, in this van right on the North Korean border in the middle of the night about the Holy Trinity. I attempted to explain to him the mystery of the Holy Trinity. You know, in Orthodox Christianity, that's a very central teaching, you know, a very Trinitarian. And we had this long discussion. And finally, by the end of it, he said, Andrew, I think words are getting in the way of our understanding here. We don't have these kinds of words in Korean, even within the Korea, because there were Orthodox churches in Korea. He said, you must have had made up new words to describe this in Korean when you converted people in South Korea to the Orthodox Church. Because these concepts are not really how we think. So interesting, but he has become a very close friend of mine over a very long time. So my point here is that I think I was prepared in terms of understanding this, the traditions, but how it affected development is something that evolved over time. I had a rule that when I traveled, I had to meet with whatever the religious leaders were of the society. And I'll tell you, my first trip was the first week of September and the second week of September, 2001. And I was in Macedonia, and I asked the U.S. ambassador and the aid mission director for me to meet the religious leaders of the 4 traditions. There were 2 big traditions. There was an Albanian Muslim imam, who's the head of the 25% of the population of Macedonia, Slavic Macedonia, approximately is Muslim. And the rest of the society principally are Macedonian Orthodox Christians. So I met the Archbishop of the church. There is a small Jewish community, and there's a small Methodist community converted to Methodist Protestantism in the 1870s by the British missionaries. Boris Tchaikovsky, the president of Macedonia at the time, was an ordained Methodist pastor. And I asked him, I said, how did you get elected? He said, because there's so few of us, we don't threaten anyone. So the Jews and the Methodists are the ones who are the mediators in the Civil War that was almost starting. And that's why I asked to meet with them. The U.S. ambassador said, we've really never had a meeting of these people before. And in fact, we called them, Andrew, because you asked to see them, and they said, we've never been in the same room together. I said, well, that's a little problem. He said, this is Macedonia, not the United States. The United States, you religious leaders, you always meet all the time together. We don't do that here. I said, well, we're going to do it tonight. So I want to meet with you. It was a 2-hour conversation. The first hour, everybody was polite. They put the stuff on the table. And then the Macedonian Orthodox Archbishop was a young man. He was only 40 years old. And the imam of the Muslim community got into it. Now, there were no punches thrown, no guns, okay? But it got rather intense. And they began accusing each other's communities of the violence. And I said, now, we need to calm this down. We're going to have a discussion about it. And we did. Now, I said, the reason I'm going to tell you why I asked you, after 2 hours, why I asked you to meet. I want you to draft a statement of the 4 traditions condemning violence as a solution to the political problems in Macedonia. I want you to issue it publicly. You decide what it says. We're not going to draft it. And the ambassador said, boy, that was interesting, Andrew. He said, I want to do that again. This is very interesting. So he had a reception for me later on, and the 4 of them were, of course, invited, and they were over in the corner the whole time, and there was intense discussion going on, but only the 4 of them. The ambassador said, Andrew, I think you and I should stay away from the discussion. Let's let them talk. If it breaks up, then maybe we can go intervene. It didn't break up. They talked for 3 hours, and then for several weeks, and then for several months. They wrote a statement, but the Albanian imam was a little nervous he was going to get assassinated if they translated it into Albanian. So he said, I will sign it in Macedonian Slavic. I will not sign it in Macedonian, because then I could get assassinated. He didn't say this publicly, but this is what happened. Well, you may not know it, but there was no civil war in Macedonia. They fixed it politically through a set of very I was just in Macedonia, Slavic Macedonia. I have to say Slavic because this is a sensitive issue in Greek Macedonia, so I have to be careful not to get in trouble with my own community. It's holding, the settlement's holding. Now, I don't want to suggest that that meeting led to this, but it certainly contributed to calming the situation down, because all four of them said, we do not want a bloodbath here. We do not want Bosnia repeated in Macedonia. Okay? Now, the point to this is AID was getting involved, and I was getting AID involved in conflict resolution, not from a diplomatic standpoint, but from a religious tradition, and you will hear about this because AID has issued, long after I left, a new manual from the CMM office, the Conflict Mitigation. Richard, is it still called that? The Office of Conflict? It still is. I thought they were going to change the name or something.
No, we changed our office.
You changed the OMAs, something else? Okay, what is it called now?
Civil Military
Oh,
Cooperation.
that's good. That's fine. I created this office called Conflict Mitigation and Management when I was at AID, and it's still there, thank heaven, and they're doing some very good work and looking at toolkits on how you deal with religious traditions and development and conflict, most importantly conflict. How can we use an understanding of the religious traditions to diminish conflict and to be forces of reconciliation in the society? And the point here is that in some of these societies, once again, the only officials that have legitimacy in the eyes of the public are the religious leaders. The government is seen as corrupt, and the business community, which in most of these societies is simply indistinguishable from the government, are also seen as corrupt. Okay? So the only functioning, and there are NGOs, and some of them are secular, but the reality is the functional institution of the religious institution. So when the religious leaders get together, they do have influence. And they can make things worse, which sometimes they do, but most of the time, my experience is the religious leaders try to calm things down. That's not the impression in the West, but that is true, in my experience at least. So every country I visited about 100 countries in the last 20 years. I can't remember how many of them were when I was at AID, but it was a lot. I met with the church leaders, and I had some of the most fascinating conversations. I will just tell you one story. In Ethiopia, I went and I met the Patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. They are not in communion with our ecumenical patriarch, the Pope of the Orthodox Church in, you call it Istanbul, but in the Orthodox Church we still refer to it as Constantinople. And they are of the Coptic Church, and that we call this the Oriental Orthodox Church, without getting into the theological reasons for that. But they still are very close. And so when we have Orthodox meetings, the Patriarch from Addis will be there, and he will acknowledge with respect our ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew. And I went and visited him. And then I visited, and 40% of Ethiopia, 50% is Ethiopian Orthodox Christian, and the 40% is Muslim. And so there is a council of imams, and I went to see the council of imams, in fact, all of whom are Sufists. And two interesting stories from this trip. One is the Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood from Sudan, had sent in provocateurs to burn down Orthodox churches in the villages in the highlands, because for 1,000 years now, the Ethiopian Orthodox and the Muslims have helped build each other's religious institutions physically. The Orthodox Christians will build the mosques, and the Muslims will help build the Orthodox churches in the village. They get together and they do it together. And when the patriarch of the church appears, all the Muslims come to hear him because he is a revered figure in the Muslim community and respected figure. He speaks with authority. Okay? When they started burning down these churches, the imams and the patriarch said, we're not doing this. You can do this if you want somewhere else. We have had peace here for 1,000 years. We're not putting up with this. And they threw them out, and they haven't had any trouble since. They sealed the border. Okay? But they've had what we have, which is this kind of tolerance. Now, the dominant elites in the country were all Orthodox Christians. So the Muslims who come from the Oromo tribe, which has been sort of oppressed, if you talk to them, that's how they feel. So there are tensions. There are tensions in the society. But at the local level, people get along with each other. And I'll tell you a story that the Patriarch himself told me. He said, you know, when the AIDS pandemic started, we had no money, and no one talked about this, but he has a PhD from Yale, theology school. And he said, I know what was causing it, and I did a tour of all the villages. And everybody would come, Muslim and Christian, and he would say, are you being faithful to your spouse? Because both our traditions demand faithfulness. And two, are your children at home? Do you know what they're doing in the evening? Are they being faithful to the faith traditions and the moral teachings of the church or the mosque? And if they're not, you're at risk from the disease. And he spoke around. Now, he didn't tell me. This was in the 1990s. I had nothing to do with this. This was under Clinton. This was the field staff of AID had asked the Patriarch to do this because they didn't have any money for AIDS then. So what we did was we went to the religious leaders. We gave him the truck. We planned his trip. We paid for the gas. And the pastors and imams and the mullahs from the mosques, they organized the meetings, and he spoke. And he was very proud of it. Very proud of it. So the mosque and the church played an early role in attempting to stop the spread of the disease, and they used simply their own moral teaching as a way of convincing people to be careful with the disease as it was spreading. What else here? I know there's a very important book, and if you haven't read it, you ought to read it. It's principally about Christian denominations' involvement in peacemaking. It's called Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft by Douglas Johnson. And Doug Johnson is the CEO of, and we're going to, are you speaking at all? No, but the executive director is here. Are you executive director or the program director? Okay, executive vice president. And this is, and it's case studies by scholars. It's not by religious leaders. It was historians wrote this about the role principally of the church. And there's some in the last chapter from other traditions. And the first chapter is about the Franco-German rapprochement after World War II. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but it's written by Edward Luttwak, a very prominent Israeli military historian. And I had never read this before. You ought to read it, really. It's quite fascinating. Because it was a Lutheran pastor, who was a pacifist, called Rural Rearmament, that in fact arranged over a 3-year period to take the German and French elites to a castle in Austria for small group seminars that led to the rapprochement, because the Allies were going to start shooting all the German elites. I don't know if you know this. There was a serious plan to just take them out and shoot them because everybody was fed up with what happened with not just the First World War, the Second World War, but the First World War. And then, of course, the French remember the Franco-German War from the 1870s. And so they were going to take revenge. You know what stopped the Allies from doing this? The Holocaust. When they found the camps, they said, oh, my God. Some of them generally did not know what was going on, and certainly they didn't know it to what degree. But they began to say, we can't start shooting the Germans because then we'll be accused of being no different than Hitler. So, religion can play a historically, and the chapter that Luttwak has in this book says that the beginning of the common market and of the European Union was not just the Marshall Plan, it was the seminars. At the end of the chapter, he said the biggest weakness of the State Department, and I might add the military, he doesn't say the military, but it's true for the military too, is there are no people who follow these issues. The chaplains may in the military, but chaplains really are there to be chaplains to the soldiers and the airmen and the sailors, not to reach out to other religious leaders. That's not what an original mission of the chaplain corps, at least as I understand it, was. But it's changing, it's evolving. And the point is that Edward Luttwak said there should be a religious attaché, just like we have an economics attaché or a political attaché in each embassy. I was U.S. envoy to Sudan, and I had to go to Libya repeatedly because Gaddafi was deeply involved in the civil war in Darfur. And I said I would like to go see because there are Greeks everywhere. There are an Orthodox church in almost every country in the world, and I said there must be one here, and in fact there was. And it was a very robust church. And Gaddafi had just given the Anglican church an old cathedral, and the first day of the first service ever held in the Anglican cathedral in 50 years was being held the day I went to see the Orthodox priest in the Orthodox Church. And I asked the officer, I said, how do you know these guys? He said, I'm the religious attaché. So apparently there's been a change. This was 2007. There's been a change in diplomatic policy where the ambassadors are now appointing young officers to be the liaison to the. This is a major step forward. And some of this was going on before, but some ambassadors are very nervous that they could get into a lot of trouble. I got into trouble in AID. I'll tell you an amusing story. And then we ended this at 7, but you want Q's and A's, right? I'll end with this story. When the first thing in a post-conflict setting, highly unstable, a lot of casualties, you do is you open the schools to get, not for education purpose, to get the kids off the street. You don't want kids in the street because there are landmines and guns and bad stuff happens. You want to discipline the children in some hierarchical structure to order their lives better. And it helps for a variety of reasons to do it. So our first strategy, other than feeding people in Afghanistan following the first defeat of the Taliban, was to open all the schools up immediately. And I'm not going to go through all the things we did, but we planned when the troops were going in, we started the planning. We found a curriculum that was the old Royalist curriculum. It had a lot of unbelievable stuff in it. It was terrible. It was all subjects, all grades, 1 through 12, except for religion. Yes, it's interesting. We couldn't do the religion because I knew I would have gotten into trouble. But you know who did the religious textbooks for all the public schools in Afghanistan? The Iranian government. I asked a congressman who started yelling at me for doing any of this stuff, and I said, would you prefer Iran doing the religious textbooks or us? And he stopped. He didn't yell at me anymore. I said, because that's who's doing it. I didn't do it because I thought you guys would be furious. Now, the reason we got into trouble is the first page of every book, mathematics, biology, geography, history, English, Dari, whatever the book was, is the first page of the Quran. The God almost merciful, the beginning prayer of the Quran is in the first page of the book, but the only page. An evangelical pastor from Tennessee threatened to sue me in court. There is a left-wing group. It's this folk singer who wants to protect the First Amendment from attacks. I can't remember the guy's name, but he has this group on the left that constantly sues people over religious symbols in public. And so he was coming. We were getting sued at the same time in court by the religious community on the more conservative side and on the more liberal side because we had this first page from the Quran. The Minister of Education said to me, if it's not in the book, you take it out and you print it, I will burn all the books and none of them are going to be distributed. There will be no textbooks in the school. I said, then I will take the risk of getting sued. What we did do is we told each of these two people who are going to sue us that the other side was suing us. So really, we would appreciate both of them doing it at the same time because it makes it more defensible for us. Both of them then dropped their lawsuits, which I did appreciate them doing. But here's the First Amendment thing again. We paid for the books. There's no ministries in Kabul at the time. This was in January of 2002. We did this. We have since, by the way, published 67 million textbooks, the same textbook, slightly improved. The first page of the Quran is still in every single book, every single book. And the ministry won't let anybody change the text. Actually, they need to be changed because they need to be upgraded. So my last comment is that you may get into trouble by doing it. I don't think you will. I think it's easily defensible. I would quote Peter Berger. If the rest of the world lives in a particular religious vision, and it's the only authority structure that exists in the society, how can you deal with the society unless you deal with the religious leaders? I just leave that with that question.